through the crew, we saw an adult female fallen. Robbins residence, 11 Chester's Place, between Jones Quarry Road and the dead end.
What do we got here? Are you having any symptoms, Mr. JH? Can you tell me how you feel? Are you hurting anywhere? Are there any strange noises? Having a hard time getting started in the morning? All right. Well, let's pull some labs and do some scans, and we'll see what we can do for you. We'll just plug you in. It appears we can't do that. Hey guys, Meredith here with Madam Diesel. Today, let's talk about what happens when our patient can't tell us what's wrong. So the vast majority of the time, our engines aren't always able to tell us exactly what's going on. We can't just listen to them and hear them complain about how we're operating them improperly. So in this case, our engine actually ran quite well. It didn't have any weird noises. It wasn't hard to start. It shifted in and out of gear, no problem. So how did it end up on my workbench? Well, there were some subtle hints that I was able to glean both from the client himself, but also seeing the engine in person to make a determination. Where all this comes from is, I worked on the ambulance several years ago, and it's exactly the same with human patients. Whether they can talk to you or not, doesn't really matter. We're trained to make an assessment as we walk through your front door, and within minutes come up with some sort of determination on our treatment plan, whether you're going to the hospital or not, like whether I need more assistance, that sort of thing. While it's not as critical usually on an engine, the same process follows, and a good diagnostician is able to figure out what's going on because they have a very clear understanding of how this unit works as a whole. So having a basic understanding of the diesel engine itself, that's super important. But then also being able to pull a really extensive history, or as much of a history as you can, and piecing all those bits and bobs together to come up with a solution. In this case, I have no idea how the original owner many years ago treated this engine. However, I actually do. I know for a fact this engine was broken in properly. I know for a fact that at least for a number of years, this engine was run good and hard. It was run properly based on things that I'm seeing. And then from the current owner, getting a history of his operation of this engine and things as they developed, at least in recent years, have been able to point me in a direction of what might have failed on this thing, so I know how to treat it. So after kind of analyzing the history on how this engine was operated, whether it's your own personal history of owning the engine yourself or what a previous owner has told you in terms of, how did it run? What kind of repairs did they do? Do you have any invoices that showed any sort of work that was previously done prior to your experience with the engine? Now, this counts for, a marine diesel, the truck, whatever engine you're dealing with. If you weren't the only owner with this thing, there's going to be pieces of history that are missing. And that's okay. We don't need every minute and second account of how this engine operated from the day it was built at the factory. However, I do want to try to glean as much information as I can because that's going to help me look at the right things. And I'm going to coincide that with the inspection I did on the customer's boat where we could actually run this engine and take a look at some of the symptoms it was having, while it ran in the boat. Now that it's on my workbench, I can't do all those things you know, really the only thing I can do is talk to the customer directly over the phone. In this case, he and I were the ones who pulled the head the other day, and we were able to actually see some of these signs that tells us more of how this engine spent its early lifetime. I want to show you a couple things here because these couple things tell me quite a bit of how this engine actually ended up on my workbench in the end. This engine ran really well. It started up really easily, so I never suspected low compression or super low compression. I didn't think there were any broken piston rings or anything like that. However, this engine had a ton of blow-by, a ton of smoke, and it had a sheen of oil coming out of the exhaust when it ran, and you could see that on the surface of the water. So good initial inspection, just looking at everything, will tell you a lot about this engine prior to ever tearing anything apart. Once things are torn apart, though, knowing where to look and what to look at and what it means is going to help you kind of zone in on what exactly happened. So even though I wasn't there day one, I have a pretty good idea of how this engine started its life based on what I'm seeing with both, you know, my cylinders and the cylinder head. I haven't even finished tearing this entire engine apart, and I already have an idea of what exactly is going on. So I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to zoom in on cylinder 1 because this is kind of an interesting cylinder. Let's see if I can get you in there real close and so you can see what's happening. And I'm just sitting right behind you. I'm going to zoom you in one more time. And hopefully you can see that clearly. So this is cylinder 1. And we've got our intake and exhaust valves right here. And one thing you'll notice on every single one of the cylinders is this white kind of frosty looking stuff. And what this stuff is a sign of excess fuel burning. It's a sign of incomplete combustion. This valve was getting real hot. This valve was also getting pretty hot. This is what it looks like when you've had a bunch of incomplete combustion. You can also see just how much carbon buildup. In fact, this corner of the valve right here is really caked. And then there's kind of an odd, you know, clean spot around the edge of the cylinder, which I think is rather interesting. And so when we were looking at that, I asked my client, I said, you know, were you running anything inside this engine? He said, yes. As a matter of fact, I was running seafoam. Well, that explains this clean area. The cylinder was essentially getting washed down with seafoam, at least for a short period of time. Not the best thing to do. However, luckily it doesn't seem to have done too much damage. All it did was clean some stuff, so yay. However, this tells me that these injectors were needing some serious service. In fact, too much time where valves are getting hot from excess fuel, eventually you're going to get a hole. You're going to get a hole in one of your valves and you're going to have major problems because you won't have any compression. So all this carbon buildup is a result of incomplete combustion from way too much fuel in the cylinder. And really, every engine is going to need, you know, the right ratio of fuel to the right ratio of air to combust evenly and efficiently. And this engine is a fairly modern engine. It's, you know, like, it shouldn't have smoke. It should fire up easily. And it should burn off most of its fuel that's, like, squirted into the cylinder. So the fact that I'm seeing evidence of excess fuel on all my cylinders, let's set you down here, tells me that these injectors were in need of service a long time ago. Now, we sent the injectors out. They have been rebuilt. So we knew, you know, injectors needed some love to begin with. However, the carbon buildup from all this excess fuel and the carbon that's been broken loose from the use of seafoam tells me that piston rings may be a problem. Moving over to the engine block, there's a couple things that we can see here. Never mind the old head gasket. We'll be scraping that off. but the initial impression after pulling the head off is that every single one of these cylinders is gorgeous on the inside. Let me see if I can't get a flashlight on that. So see cylinder number 2, see the crosshatch in there? It might be a little hard to see, but it is gorgeous. Now, another thing you might notice is all this ring ridge on every cylinder and the amount of carbon buildup that's on the pistons. I'm going to turn this engine over for you so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. There is quite a bit of carbon. Even though these, you know, pistons, the cylinders themselves look really decent. However, we've got great crosshatch, and hopefully you can see that. We've got great crosshatch down in the cylinders, but we've got an absolute ton of carbon, and it is gritty. It is super gritty. Every single one of these pistons are covered in very gritty and abrasive carbon buildup from all that excess fuel. So that is how I came to confirm, even though our cylinders look great, our piston rings most likely are either partially seized or even completely seized. And that's where we're getting our blow-by from. How do we avoid that? Well, in this case, it looks like we want to service our injectors and make sure they're functioning. So with previous owners, you know, who own this engine, the engine may have been smoking a while back, and because nothing was done, it allowed it to get to this stage. In this case, we don't want to wait until our injectors, you know, either break apart or are atomizing so poorly that we've just got a ton of carbon. Carbon is super abrasive, and you can see it, like when it's on my fingers, you can see how cruddy this stuff is. I've actually, you know, kind of lightly looked at, let's see if I can show you a little bit more. Hard to see. I've got a layer of oil just to keep this thing from getting super cruddy. But all that grit is what I'm talking about. It actually, the top of this piston feels like sandpaper. There's just absolute chunks of hard carbon. And that stuff's like sandpaper. So over time, the more carbon that this engine sees in its combustion chamber, we're going to start destroying that beautiful crosshatch. How I knew this engine was broken in properly is all 4 cylinders have really beautiful and even crosshatch. There's no vertical scoring yet. I don't know how. I am so impressed. But, you know, over time that would change. If this engine was continuing to run in this shape, we would have had a lot of vertical scoring as a result of that carbon. So I'm glad that we at least had one symptom and the sign of blow-by to tell us, okay, something's happening. We need to investigate further, because this engine can be relatively expensive to buy new. And so we don't want to wait until the point where this thing is like beyond help to finally start fixing it. Now, Yanmar and a lot of manufacturers recommend that you service your injectors every 1,000 to 1,500-ish hours. However, a lot of people wait until they full-on fail to finally do something about it. In this case, you really want to, especially in the recreational world where this engine's not being run all that hard. One final tidbit to take a look at. Let's take a look at this cylinder. And this kind of shows me some of this history. We'll grab the flashlight. I gotta clean out all that carbon. It's like literal rocks in there. Let me grab the flashlight and I'll show you how I know this engine has sat for a period of time. And this may be hard to see, but right in the middle, amongst that crosshatch, is a very light layer of rust. Now, luckily, it is fairly shallow. You can't see any rust elsewhere. I think a couple of cylinders, they had evidence of condensation starting to form. So when I asked the client about this, he mentioned, yes, the previous owner had let the boat sit for long periods of time or longer periods of time, and in a salty environment, that resulted in some condensation and in corrosion. Now, luckily with that, you know, like, I can see it, I cannot feel it. There's no pitting anywhere. Obviously, we're gonna hone the cylinders, clean them up, but that's another factor that I, you know, was able to pull from taking a history about this engine. So that's another, you know, thing to look at over time. It's like, did this engine sit? And this is kind of what I preach about to a lot of people is, you know, like, an engine that sits is an engine that dies. And so if this engine had sat for a long period of time, you know, and gotten enough condensation in it, let's take a look at these ones. Get the oil wiped off so you can actually kind of see. You know, eventually we're going to have more issues. Yeah, see the light rust in there? I'm sorry, it's really hard to do the flashlight to where you can see that, but you can actually see the corrosion on that. And luckily, it's very, very light. It's very, very minimal, but it is kind of throughout the cylinders. Now, these cylinders, you can see the upper edge right below kind of the ring ridge right in this area are starting to glaze, and that makes sense, you know, but that's, I know some of the history of this engine, even though I've never spoken to, you know, the previous owner. I know this engine sat for a while, because that type of corrosion is like what you see when an engine sits unused and the pistons aren't moving. And so another good time to clean that up. I'm really impressed that these cylinders don't have more like vertical scratching. There's very minor vertical scratching, but nothing significant. So that's awesome. This engine is linered. So these liners are removable. I'll take measurements, but, you know, honestly, based on what I'm seeing, I don't even think we need to necessarily replace them. None of this stuff is deep, and the crosshatch still is there and in good shape. And so, like, a good honing, as long as they measure out and pass, you know, what the manual says they should be, there's no reason to replace the liners. However, we will replace rings. We'll clean up all these cylinders, and then, you know, probably put new bearings in it as well, since this engine's on the workbench. The next thing I'm curious about is, with that much carbon, what do our main bearings down below look like? So that's kind of be the next thing is, okay, now we know we've had a bunch of carbon circulating. Not enough to score cylinders yet. However, if that carbon was picked up by the oil, it's going to be going through our bearings. So that's certainly another thing to consider. We're already in there replacing them anyways, but I'm curious, like, what kind of damage that did, just because of the fact that we were running failing injectors on this thing. That's all that, you know, really caused a lot of this. That and the engine sat for a little while. You know, that could have turned into kind of a major issue over time. Luckily, the current owner is running this engine good and hard. And honestly, that might have been what saved it, is, you know, he wasn't afraid to run this thing hard. And so, you know, these engines can bounce back to a degree, not all the time, but certainly, you know, enough that they can function for years to come. I don't suspect that, you know, this engine would have thrown a rod or anything. However, it would have lost power over the long term. And luckily, because he was maintaining it properly, a lot of the items within this engine are actually in decent shape and can be, like, cleaned up and reused. So that's always a positive thing. I'm happy to see that. It just means that, you know, we don't have to like find a whole new engine block or something like that, and that certainly is going to save him time and money. Well, you guys heard it here first. This is why that engine failed. Injectors. So a pretty minor maintenance item that was neglected, and as a result, we got a significant amount of blow-by. Oakham and I are going to head home for the night. Thank you for joining us, and I will see you guys in the next video.